A new path-breaking report by the University of Leipzig, the details of which we are bringing to you right now because the report has been released as we speak, says that this month, July, is the hottest month ever recorded in the world. Perhaps the hottest month in 120,000 years, with an average temperature about 1.5 degrees hotter than the planet was before it was warmed by burning coal, by gas, by oil, by all sorts of other human activity. Here's what the data shows us. It shows us, broadly speaking, that temperatures will continue to increase and extreme weather conditions will become worse unless there's a drastic drop in the use of fossil fuel until we reach net zero emissions. This month, July's average global temperature is between 1.2 and 1.7 degrees centigrade above average July temperatures before humans began warming the planet by burning fossil fuels. There have been several erratic weather patterns around the world in July. We'll come to that in a moment. But increased rainfall intensity, the frequency of heat waves, they're all directly linked to rising sea and surface temperatures. That is a huge problem which is all a part of this. Now again, in terms of specific examples, our own monsoon in India has been violent, it's been erratic. Those words have been used in that report. There's a growing risk of flooding. We've seen the impact of this in just the last few weeks. Actions to cut emissions, and this is the big challenge, are still inadequate. The world may be destined to fail the 1.5 degree limit set in the Paris Agreement. If we don't reduce global warming to within 1.5 degrees, then we are in deep, deep trouble. Now, the report is important because we see climate change all around us. The examples just this month alone are shocking. And the University of Leipzig has actually come out with several details. We'll just give you a few examples. In July, there have been 23 consecutive days of global temperatures above the previous record. The hottest ever ocean waters have been recorded in one location, ocean waters off the coast of Florida in the United States. The hottest night ever recorded globally has been registered at Death Valley in the United States at 48.9 degrees centigrade, the hottest night temperature that. At 52.2 degrees centigrade, China recorded its hottest days, also the hottest recorded temperature above 43 degrees north latitude. There's been a record low Antarctic sea ice recorded this month. That's seen to be a 1 in 13 billion year event. So those are just a couple of examples. Let's take a look at a couple of reactions before we bring in the author of this report.
The era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived. The air is unbreathable, the heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable.
If we don't stick to 1.5 degrees, what can happen?
It's a great question, and the answer is incredibly complex. Climate and weather impact on almost everything around our globe, and you've listed a few of the things just already, things like heat waves and Arctic sea ice. The list of things goes on. If you just take one example, which is increased heat extremes, that obviously affects people's health. It affects people's mental health. It affects agriculture, livestock and crops. It affects our water resources because evaporation goes up. It affects labour productivity. So higher temperatures result in lower labour productivity. It impacts on our biodiversity. So it impacts on the natural environment in big ways through things like fires and heat extremes. And so when we start to look at the evidence for climate change impacts, it's everywhere around us already. That's what the last IPCC report showed, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report showed. We don't have to wait for decades for climate change to be here with us. It's here right now.
Professor Haustein, tell us about this July and the data that you've picked up now. It is the hottest July, but what strikes me is that the impact is visible in data points that you have collected from around the world. Could you share some details of that?
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of not surprising that we see these kind of records. The number is 0.2 degrees centigrade above the old record, which was only 4 years ago. And that is quite the margin, which is why we also are so confident that this July is going to be the hottest for sure, which was so easy to already announce these results. And the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, did that today as well. And it's still kind of scary, isn't it? Because it's also scratching now the 1.5 degree threshold more and more often. This is the first time it does so in a summer month. It's also the warmest month ever since we have records. Probably have to go back many thousands, if not 10,000 years to see something similar. And as we've just heard, we have to realize that the effects of climate change are already affecting us now. And it's most visible really this year, this summer. And it's, just crazy for someone who has been studying that for years.
You know, you've used the words violent and erratic. I think those were the words to describe the Indian monsoon. Dr. Haustein, could you tell us about your concerns specific to the monsoon? It affects billions across South Asia.
Yeah, the monsoon as a system is not going to break. So that's not a tipping point in the climate system. But what we do know is that the pre-monsoon, that is really important for agricultural, for crops and for the respective harvest, that is affected. Mm-hmm. So that might just fall dry, and then we end up with like a season where all these crop failures are visible. And when it comes to the actual monsoon, which is going to be more intense as far as rainfall is concerned in the future, just because there's more moisture in the atmosphere, that might lead to even more of these very detrimental and damaging flood events.
Aditya Pillai, the problem that we see in India is erratic weather patterns. When it rains much harder, and yet there are parts of our country, even now in a year when we are already in excess of the predictions for rainfall, which are seeing below average rainfall. And so in terms of a pattern, it's mixed up, right? That's one of the impacts of this climate emergency?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the major ones. And India is particularly vulnerable to that sort of thing because of the percentage of our working population that's in agriculture. And we have no way of predicting which area is going to be flooded and which area is going to be drought prone. And there's no way to build public policy systems to address that. So what does one do if, for example, over 2 years, a particular village in Haryana is flooded and then has drought-like conditions and you have 2 consecutive crop failures? So this is the sort of thing that makes it really, really vexing. And the intensity of these things is going up, right? The intensity of flooding is getting worse and the intensity of the heat during the drought is getting worse.
Professor Haustein, one of the really frightening details which did emerge was of Antarctic ice, and the findings in the month of July. It's what a once every X billion years that you see a phenomena like that. Why is the melting of Antarctic ice something which can affect ecosystems around the world? I think you're on mute.
Antarctica is a bit of a...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. Antarctica is a bit of a special continent in that the circulation is different to most of the rest of the world. And it can be, like the cold in winter can be locked up there, or it can be released. And on the other hand, like warm air can intrude into the continent, which it did this year. And depending on the circulation, the sea ice can change a lot. The anomalies of the sea ice can change a lot. And what we are expecting that the extremes like this year become more extreme, and what the effects are for the global climate change is first and foremost, it's the sea ice melt. It's that these Antarctic ice sheets become unstable, and this is like the most efficient contributor really to sea level rise. In terms of like the global circulation, I think we have to look at El Nino, La Nina, the central tropical Pacific, and it's obviously a contributor already to the heat that we are seeing across the globe, but the effects are only going to be seen in the remainder of the year and early 2024, and that should certainly give more reason for concern.
Professor Houghton, let's talk a little bit more about various atmospheric conditions and weather patterns actually contributing to a rise in seawater temperatures, Antarctic ice melting faster, Arctic ice melting faster, temperatures increasing as well. Would that possibly mean that low-lying areas where there are coral formations, island formations, or peninsular regions would be some of the worst hit, which means a direct impact on millions of people living in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the concern. This is nothing new. We have all these simulations. We kind of know what sea level rise is going to look like. All we didn't know so far is how quick it can actually happen. And with an extreme year like that, like this year in Antarctica, it's certainly another harbinger for what is to come. And for like low-lying areas like India, especially Bangladesh, where we have huge vulnerable populations, they will be affected first. And this is, what some of these like Western, more developed countries forget, that this is really something they have caused, because the cumulated emissions, they matter. And the cumulated emissions, they are caused by those countries, and they have to take the responsibility there. And obviously for decades they have been doing that. And this is what we as climate scientists keep saying, and we are ringing the alarm bell, I guess, for decades, and yet there is no will really to tackle the issue. And I can only hope that as much as, these like temperature records, these floods that we are seeing, that they then lead to action before, we see more catastrophic events unfolding.
Professor Mark Houghton, would you like to take that point and that question of low-lying areas being impacted, our coral treasures around the world being impacted, marine diversity being impacted as a result of rising seawaters and warmer seas?
Indeed, and just to pick up the thread from the previous speaker, looking first at sea level rise, what we're seeing is multiplicative, multiple things which are looking worse and worse over time. So, for example, the sea level is actually going up faster and faster over time, so it's accelerating. We're seeing the estimated number of people affected by sea level rise, a given level of sea level rise, is much higher now, because we've got better ways of estimating how many people are going to be affected. So different measurement techniques. And we're also seeing interaction between different factors, different climate-driven factors. So when you have sea level rise and you have a big cyclone or typhoon, you get a lot more flooding, you get bigger storm surges. So it's the combination of sea level rise and the stronger typhoons that we're seeing as a proportion of the total cyclones or typhoons. So you're getting multiple things happening at once in terms of that sea level rise and the damage. And then if you're living by the coast, as you just said, we're seeing the ecosystems, the coral systems, the seagrass systems and others being affected by high temperatures. So for a long time now, we've actually seen coral deaths, that's coral bleaching, when you get very high temperatures in the ocean. But we're also seeing ocean acidification, because as the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, the pH drops, so that it gets slightly more acidic. And those things interact with each other. And then you have more wave energy and those big cyclones, and you have a whole series of things which are impacting negatively. And so we need to be very concerned about the impacts of climate change and how those impacts interact with each other. Sea level rise, increased cyclones, increased temperature, reduced oxygen, reduced alkalinity in our oceans, because all of those things add up. They're not separate, they interact.
Aditya, how would you respond to people who say that we're still a long way away from breaching that 1.5 degree mark, and some would suggest that until you hit 2 degrees, it's not going to be profoundly life-altering? This is what pessimists of perhaps this program would suggest. How would you respond to them?
I'd say it's a big warning. The fact that the WMO just a few months ago, in fact, we discussed this on the show, they came out and said that at least one of the next 5 years has a 66% chance of breaching 1.5. The Paris Agreement and every country on earth got together and said 1.5 is the threshold we promise not to cross, we would like not to cross, and 2 definitely something we don't want to cross. So this is enshrined in ways that obviously give it importance, it gives it weight. And we're seeing right now, right today, as you list out, this litany of instances and damages that are causing people serious economic discomfort. People are losing lives every day, right? So there's not a lot of time left for us to react to this. I'm glad you spoke about mitigation right off the bat, because now the pressure's on COP28, COP29, COP30, because this is where we need to come to some sort of consensus on aggressive global decarbonization with equity baked in for developing countries. But I also want to say one thing. I mean, for viewers listening to all of these impacts, all is not lost. Right, and I think there's sometimes a feeling that things might be hopeless, and these are reasons to despair. This is a bit like the first session on the second day of a test match, right? There's a long way to go yet. There's a lot to play for. There's a lot on the table, and if we do 3 or 4 big things right, we can actually stave off a lot of this and keep things within manageable range, right? But those 3 or 4 big things are a bit like renovating your house, right? It's a lot of discomfort. You really have to sort of step out of your house.
And it's a lot of money.
For a couple of months, where it goes on. And it's a lot of money. That's the discomfort you have to bear. But once you move back in, hopefully life is better. And you could create a better world out of this, right? Stronger local government capacity, for example, a welfare state, social safety nets. These are things that are good to have.
Dr. Haustein, we are seeing huge transformations around the world when it comes to the adoption of electric vehicles. We've seen a lot of technological change as far as batteries are concerned. We are seeing a record adoption of solar energy. Certainly in my country, India, we are well on our path to water. Is that enough to make a difference?
I mean, it's definitely more than that. And this is what gives me hope. And I think I'm not the only one here. And we just heard how all these changes, all these investments eventually lead to a better world. So even if it wasn't for climate change, that's what people have been saying for years. We should be doing those things. And so I'm thrilled to see that we now eventually see like the electric mobility, like ramping up the way, we were hoping. The same is true with renewables in China and India, even parts of Europe, and I might say even the wildest part of the US, Texas, Kansas, like the flyover states. You see wind parks of epic proportions. And so people know that this is the way to go. And obviously now it's financially feasible. And it's going to be like a no-brainer for everyone. So I think we are on the right track. And perhaps there's a bit of a surprise package there that we pick up speed quicker than anticipated. Yet there are a couple of segments that are difficult to decarbonize. And obviously that's where we need to continue to have conversations. And I might also add to the previous point that, 1.5 is certainly an agreed on threshold. But it's not baked in stone that we are all going to die after that. It's certainly not going to happen. It's a slow process. Even 2 degrees is something which is going to be really, really tricky and really dangerous, but still we are not going to die. Every 1/10 of a degree matters. And this is what we have to fight for, whether it's 1.6, 1.7, 1.8. And I think we have gotten a memo on a global scale. Just we all have to fight for more efforts.
Professor Mark Howden, is it your sense that in the meanwhile, temperatures will keep rising?
Yeah, the science is very clear, is that while we continue to have our foot on the climate change accelerator, greenhouse gas emissions, the temperature will go up on average, and we'll see more and more of the temperature extremes and similar things that we've talked about so far. And that science is very robust and it's been around for a long, long time. The challenge for us is that even though we have the Paris Agreement and we have electric vehicles and solar panels and all those sorts of things, our global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. Last year was the record emissions. It broke the previous year. The year before that, which was COVID, was a little dip, but the year before that was a record, etc. So we haven't taken our foot off the climate change accelerator, and we need to do that very, very soon if we're to stick to 1.5 or even 1.6 or 1.7. So the IPCC is very clear on that. We need to have very rapid, very large, and very sustained greenhouse gas emission reductions. That's carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases. And just to pick up one of the threads that was talked about before, which includes the costs of climate change and the costs of adapting to climate change and the costs of impacts of climate change. Again, the IPCC's analysis is pretty clear, and that is taking action on climate change, reducing our emissions and adapting to climate change is far, far more economically beneficial than not doing anything. The worst thing we can do economically is actually just let it rip. And so that's a really clear message for policymakers. It's a really clear message, I think, for people around the globe, is that's the thing we can't afford to do.
Look, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us and speaking to us at length about all of these issues. The world needs to wake up. We certainly, as journalists, need to keep sharing this message. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. We're out of time. On Left, Right and Centre, from all of us here, good night.